So would you say that same-sex attraction, is it nature to some degree? How do you look at the origin of same-sex attraction from a clinical perspective?
So I want to help us look at this from an attachment lens. There is also a religious lens to look at it through. But first, let's talk about it through an attachment lens. Children need to know that they're loved unconditionally. Full stop, as they say. That doesn't happen perfectly. It happened perfectly, I think, in one family, the Holy Family. And in every other family, I would call it a spectrum of knowing how beloved you are, because your family is meant to model God's unconditional love for us. So for those who that doesn't happen to a degree that causes attachment insecurity, meaning the caregivers I'm geared to being bonded with and to know that they can meet my needs, when they're not able to meet them, that can develop into what we call an insecure or anxious attachment style. So I would argue from an attachment lens perspective, children who have insecure attachments with their parents, with other confluent factors, are susceptible to certain psychological issues. One being same-sex feelings that can develop. At around age 2 or 3, for instance, if a boy is insecurely attached to his primary attachment figure is mom, but there's some insecurity in that attachment, at that age, he's meant to, according to a lot of developmental models, to shift his primary attachment to dad at the gender identity phase of development, which is around 2 to 4 years old, is what a lot of people think.
You're saying that's a healthy thing.
That's a good thing,
to
right?
shift to dad at around 2.
For men. And I'm talking about men and same-sex attraction from a male developmental perspective. There's nuances and different angles to consider with women. So at around age 2 to 4 years old is when we see boys needing to shift from mom as primary attachment figure to dad. But when, due to a variety of issues that doesn't occur as completely as it should, men can have what I would call gender insecurity start to emerge and develop. That could be due to both psychological factors in the family, but also external factors like interference or interruption through abuse, or peer issues, or an older sibling causing problems, or even genetic predisposition. And that's the kind of elephant in the room. How much of this is nature, right? We don't know how much. We know it's a significantly smaller than majority percentage. Most studies estimate genetic predispositions at around 28%. And that's not even like a single gene characteristic. That's a combination of genetic predispositions that total 28% of genetic predisposition towards developing same-sex sexual feelings and behaviors in adulthood. But keep in mind, most psychological traits that we consider normal for treating in therapy have genetic predispositions on average around 45%. And it's around 28 to 33% for same-sex attraction, according to the Ghana et al. Study, which was the largest study ever done on the human genome. And that mirrors what we see over and over through twin studies. So let's say 32, 33% genetic predisposition. Guess what the likelihood of being religious is? Predisposition, 33%. But we don't say someone is born religious or not.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's so fascinating, because the narrative today is you're born this way and you're a bigot if you don't acknowledge that or accept that. And there's no conversation, I think, happening nationally. You're not allowed to have the conversation about whether there were issues in your childhood, there were deficits, I think you used the word, that led to same-sex attraction, because same-sex attraction is supposed to be seen as, if not even a neutral, a good thing, that is an innate and affirmative thing, a positive thing. So what would be some examples of, you mentioned the attachment to a male figure, a father, between the ages of 2 and 4 would be important for boys as an example. What would be some examples of why same-sex attraction might develop because of that other 70% or so experiences that a kid might have?
And as I answer
Am
this,
I understanding the data correctly? So you're saying roughly 30% is due to genetic predisposition. So the 70 other % of this happening,
it has to be environmental factors.
Is environmental factors. So yeah, I guess the question is then, to be more clear here, what are those environmental factors?
So I'm going to explain some that I think both relate to my own story, but also to the stories of hundreds of other men and people I know and clients I've worked with. And I'm going to share with you that the church has not been silent on this either. The Catholic Church has released document after document throughout the 20th century in the United States and internationally through the Congregation of Christian Education, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, identifying these same types of factors as potential causal factors for the emergence of homosexuality. For instance, they've said things like exposure to pornography through, like, they say license and shows and publications was the old-timey phrase they use, but exposure to pornography, which we know happens at an extremely early age right now with children. That's a trauma. Okay, so especially if somebody's already insecurely attached with their same-sex father figure, and on top of that is sensitive, as a predisposition towards some of these things that make maybe more susceptible to developing these issues, combine that with negative peer experiences with their male same-sex peers, and then early exposure to pornography, well, unmet attachment needs can become sexualized because that energy, that longing, that desire for a father to give me attention, affection, and approval, that for either due to a lack of the attunement of the father or other factors contributing to an difficulty in integrating or internalizing that attachment, might make that child susceptible to developing a sexualized attachment if exposed early to pornography. And the church identified that in multiple documents as a potential causal factor. They also talked about abuse being a potential causal factor for the emergence of homosexuality.
Sexual abuse or any abuse.
And other abuse, but especially sexual abuse. The church also identified, and these are church documents from Vatican congregations. So these are high-level church teaching documents. So we don't have to have certainty, though, about what causes same-sex attraction to know that the church also says it's objectively, the inclination itself is objectively disordered. The acts are intrinsically disordered. The inclination itself is objectively disordered. So my question is, I'll share some more examples as we talk, but if something is objectively disordered, did it come from nothing? Is it objectively disordered by default? I would say we should be more curious than that. And even if we don't know the exact answer for every person in every circumstance, at least give them the opportunity and the right to reflect on their own life and think, what might have happened that contributed to why I have this objectively disordered inclination? And how can I invite God's love into that part of my heart or soul or body or mind?
I think that's such a good point, Michael. And even if you're not a Catholic or Christian or practicing faith, the studies that have been done show that, maybe 30% of this is from nature, same-sex attraction and sexual identity, and then the rest is from environmental factors. Even separate from a religious context, shouldn't people be curious?
Yes.
What were the environmental factors that led to my sexual interests and attractions?
Yeah, and I would argue too, irrespective of what caused them, I have the right as an individual to respond to them according to my conscience. So that means that whether or not I can determine what caused them, and whether or not this person over here says that's not what happened to you, or they have a different narrative to explain my story, I still get to choose my path. Me, the individual, not somebody else outside, external to me. You are not my conscience, outside person. I've been given a conscience. And I think St. Henry Newman said, the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. And so we have the right to conscience, even if the studies show something different one day. What if they showed something different one day? Well, I wouldn't change my conscience, and it wouldn't change my belief that Jesus has a better plan for our sexual impulses. The Catechism says basically they make it simple. They're like, either man governs his passions and becomes happy, or becomes governed by his passions and becomes unhappy. So the choice is not black and white totally, because it's a journey to get there. Chastity is a journey, but we're all called to that journey. No one gets a pass, even if you don't struggle with same-sex attraction. We all have that exacting work to respond to grace in our life, to try to integrate our conscience with our sexual feelings.
Can you share more about your story? You said, you're an example of this, in the environmental factors leading to same-sex attraction. And then you also shared you've talked to now hundreds of other people and know now their stories. What are some more of those environmental factors?